Hello, welcome to our first week's lecture on effective conflict intervention. My name is Frank Markow. I'll be your professor for this class. In this first week, we're going to talk about some foundational concepts. We're going to introduce what is conflict in an organizational context, why is conflict management important. We're also going to look at some of the ancient roots of dealing with conflict. And then we're going to introduce this idea that you've probably heard about, but maybe you're not exactly clear on what it is, which is this idea of win-win. So hang on as we explore the wonderful world of conflict intervention. Now, first thing we want to do is define conflict. And you might be saying, well, I've been through so many conflicts myself, I could probably define it for myself. Maybe you could, but it's good to get some concepts from people who have been thinking about and researching this and giving practical advice on how to deal with it. And so we'll start with a definition from Wilmot and Hawker. Now, their definition says that conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goal. Now, there's a few things in this definition here that are worth noting. It's an expressed struggle, right? So it's not just some internal conflict, I got mad about something, but it's when things become above board, so to speak, and you have an interaction with somebody and the conflict is expressed somehow, maybe in anger, frustration. We'll talk about the emotional aspects and outcomes of conflict later, but just note right now that it's something that's expressed that we can see. Also between two interdependent parties. Now, what does that mean? That means people that rely on each other and work together. They have to work together in order for their work to be accomplished. So two strangers walking down the street might not like each other, but we're talking about conflict in an organizational context where they have to work together. And then, of course, they have to perceive the incompatible goals, scarce resources, interference. So it has to do with me perceiving that you or somebody else is trying to stop me from accomplishing my goals and vice versa. And then a more simple definition from Michael Dews is that it's a discomforting difference. And so conflict, it has to, for it to be true conflict, it has to cause you to feel uncomfortable or angry or some negative emotion. Now, sometimes people will kind of get into little spars in a meeting or something like that, and it's all well-meaning, and they have a high level of risk conflict tolerance, and they're okay kind of going back and forth and disagreeing. That's not necessarily a conflict. A conflict has to bring up negative emotions within you. So, a conversation, a lively conversation amongst peers might not be a conflict necessarily. It's just them disagreeing and having a conversation. Now, why is conflict management important? Well, because as you probably know, conflict is a natural part of life and interactions. And sometimes we don't like to acknowledge this. We think that conflict is this weird, strange intruder into our otherwise happy lives. But conflict, as you know, is a natural part of life, and so therefore, especially organizational life, and therefore it's good for you to do a deep dive and to really understand what some of the causes and consequences and ways for dealing with it are. Poor handling of conflict can cause more damage than the issue with conflict itself. That's a really interesting thought when you think about it. It's not the conflict so much, but it's the dysfunctional strategies that we use that can cause us the most problem and can cause division in relationships and animosity and ongoing resentments and those sorts of things. Conflict always involves relationships, which we often want to preserve or enhance. Now, think about that. If you didn't really care about the other person, you didn't care about having a relationship with them, you would do whatever you want, right? You were not really thinking about keeping the relationship intact. And so conflict, because it involves relationships, we want to preserve those relationships, and that's why understanding conflict management is so important. An effective conflict resolution can lead to creative solutions, improvement, and stronger relationships. Because conflict really surfaces perspectives, and it surfaces ambitions and goals and those sorts of things. So if you're not having any conflict, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's happy. It could just mean that everything's below the surface. But when you have the culture and environment where conflict is free to be expressed, that's good because you're getting people's perspectives and input, and there's a sense of psychological safety where it's okay for me to disagree. We can disagree and still work together and be productive. And by by having the sense that I can share, that you're free to share, that's a healthy sign within your culture. And so learning how to deal with conflict really is an important thing in an organizational context in that regard. Now, Michael Dews shares what he calls the 4 awful truths about conflict. First of all, it will occur. It's inherent in human interaction. And again, as I mentioned, if you really want people to share, if you want them to feel psychologically safe, conflict is an inevitable part of that. Second is that conflict always involves some risks and costs. So by you stepping out, sharing what you want to share, confronting other people, that can be some risky, costly business. The damage in conflict results not from the conflict itself, but from the dysfunctional strategies we use to deal with it. And I mentioned that a bit earlier. And then some damage in conflict can be irreversible. So if you don't deal with conflict well, the damage can be something that you can't really recount. I mean, imagine that you're in a conflict with a coworker, and one day you just decide, heck, I've got more authority, my goals are more important than this person, so I'm really going to tell them what I think. I'm really going to put myself out there, and you raise your voice, you get angry, and then before you know it, this person doesn't like you anymore, and you don't like them anymore, and you never work to repair that relationship. That's long-term irreversible. So again, learning to deal with conflict in a healthy way can avoid a lot of those negative side effects. So what are some of the sources of knowledge about conflict? Well, listen, none of us are coming to a class like this as a blank slate. We've been learning about conflict since we were young, from our families, from our culture, from the organizations we worked at. Imagine, you're 2 years old, and the very first time you said no to Dad, and you looked up, and Dad didn't look happy, and Dad gave you a little swat on the behind to show you that he was serious about you saying yes. And so we've learned lessons all along, from childhood, from school, from classroom bullies, schoolyard bullies, from bosses that we've had. We've been picking up ideas about conflict. And so the challenge here for a class like this is to help us sort of consider those built-in implicit ideas we have about handling conflict, those unexamined assumptions, if you will, about conflict. Now, I want to transition a little bit from introducing conflict and the importance of conflict management to talking about some of the historic ancient roots of conflict management. Now, back in the day, before people were inclined to sit down and negotiate and work out their conflicts, people went to battle a lot. And when you think about some of the original, the Greeks and the Roman era, they would go to war on a regular basis. In the springtime when the kings went to war, right? We know that this was part of the ancient mentality. And after a while, they said to themselves, you know what? Maybe instead of going to war every year, maybe we could sit down and work out some of our differences here through mediation. And so this sort of led to this idea of courts and democratic institutions, which were based on logic and rhetoric and debate. So when you think about it, conflict management is a resolution to going to battle and fighting competitively against each other. Now, obviously that still happens, but we've come a long way from those historic roots, haven't we? Now, what are some of the key features of this idea of reasoning and rational approaches to dealing with conflict? Well, first of all, there has to be a general principle or law, things that we can all agree to that are true and proper. And then, of course, we have to deal with facts, right? So this is why, when you think about a courtroom, what is a courtroom? Really, it's sort of resolving a conflict. Whether you're accusing somebody of a crime or whether you're mediating like a dispute between people, like a lawsuit sort of situation, you do a lot of presenting of facts. And then you see how those facts fit with the general rule. Now, another important feature of this approach to dealing with conflict is determining what the starting point is and the status quo. The presumption is always in the favor of the status quo. So in other words, how are things currently, and is this conflict a change to tradition, to customs, to the way things have always been? And for example, we have this idea in our modern jurisprudence, this idea of innocent until proven guilty. You are innocent until we can prove you guilty. So the status quo is innocence, and then we will debate whether or not we can determine your guilt or not. And so when you're talking about reasoning and rational approaches to dealing with conflict, one of the things is you want to assess the credibility of the evidence. Are the facts true? Do we have witnesses to back up some of these claims, so to speak? And another thing that when we're trying to reason in conflict is we avoid leaps of logic and overgeneralizations. We check our opponent's logic, and sometimes we need to seek professional help. So this is what lawyers and mediation is all about. Now, of course, there's been some criticisms about this and some flaws in this entire approach, hasn't there? And so Plato's and Socrates, Plato and his pupil Socrates first said that this idea of going to court really privileges winning over discovering the truth. And isn't that even true today? Sometimes a guilty person will go to court, but he or she has a really good lawyer. And if that lawyer can speak the right language and convince the jury of the innocence of their client, well, it happens, right? And so, the truth kind of got lost. The truth of that person's guilt got lost because their lawyer was able to win in court because of their persuasive arguments. And of course, this can result in significant harm, like in divorce cases when kids have to deal with the fallout of their parents' divorce proceedings. And the assumption is that conflict is inherently competitive, leading to win-loss outcomes. And we'll talk more about win-win in just a minute here, but you think about it, when you look at conflict in this way, that somebody is going to compete, and I'm going to use facts and logic, it's kind of a win-lose proposition. I beat you because I had the relevant facts and logic, and I was able to make my case, right? Well, that perpetuates this idea that conflict always has to be adversarial. And we're going to talk about this now, the idea that conflict doesn't necessarily have to be adversarial. Now, before we get to this, though, I want to talk about the importance of developing your skills, because chances are you're going to have to do this at some point, not necessarily in court, but somebody's going to ask you to, share your perspective on this. And so we need to develop some of the skills of argumentation and logic. So here's some tips for argumentation. First of all, use forensic reasoning. Use general principles, facts, and logical consistency. Next, you got to understand what the starting point is and the presumption in favor of the status quo. You want to assess the credibility of evidence, check your logic and consider your opponent's logic, and again, seek professional help when necessary. Now, Churchill was the one who said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all others tried. And so we understand we live in kind of a messy, complex society. It's a democracy. Well, it's a representative republic, but this idea of democracy where people have a voice is important. And it's not easy, is it? But can you imagine a system where we went to war every time we had a disagreement with people, with our opponents? Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. So we talked about the transition from the warring system to the advocacy system, the adversary system. But now we're going to shift gears and talk about this idea of win-win. And Morton Deutsch, he's the first person who came up with this idea. So in 1948, Morton Deutsch, he was a graduate student. He worked with Kurt Lewin, who you're probably familiar with, but he was studying conflict in an organizational context, and he was the first one to challenge this sort of winner-loser paradigm. And this has become the foundation for contemporary management theory, this idea of win-win. Now, in the 17th century, there was A lot of changes because now you had this sort of post-Reformation idea, and now there was religious wars, right? So you had the Reformation and you had all these factions. Well, we're Catholic, well, we're Protestant. But in the 17th century, they wanted to start to deal with that and to deal with some of the intolerance for different religion traditions. And so this idea of democracy and representation became popular. And as I mentioned, Kurt Lewin in the 20th century, in the 40s, developed this idea of field theory and all of the things that Lewin contributed to our knowledge of management and organizations. And so Morton Deutsch, he came out of that field of sort of some of the early behavioral sciences and organizational behavior, thinking about different types of leadership. He was part of that school of thinking. So Deutsch came up with this idea that there was different types of conflict outcomes. There was the win-lose, right? I win and you lose. Again, this is kind of like the adversary system, where the goal is on winning, not necessarily goal compatibility or coming together. There's the no-win, no-lose. Now, this is the compromise, and we'll talk more about compromise in a bit, but when you think about what a compromise is the idea that I give up something and you give up something. That's kind of a lose-lose, right? And then there's a win-win where both parties achieve their goals. And we're going to tease this out more in the future, but you can see this is kind of a big step forward here in thinking about conflict. And so some of the practical lessons here is identifying shared goals and treating conflict collaboratively. So let me give you a brief example here. Imagine there's a football team and the coach, the head coach, and the offensive coach are trying to figure out the best strategy for coming down the home stretch. Imagine you're in the red zone and you've got 5 yards and you're down by 1 touchdown and there's 20 seconds left on the clock. Well, the coach and the offensive coordinator might have a debate over what the best play is, or should they kick a field goal, or should they run, or should they pass, right? They're going to have a discussion about that, but when you think about it, they are both on the same team, right? So they have the same goals, but they're just thinking about the goals differently. And so this is what kind of like the essence of what win-win is. When you're in an organizational context, you have the same goals, right, as the other person, but you just are thinking about how to accomplish them differently. And so this idea of win-win says, well, how can we both accomplish our goals here in order for the organization itself to win? Now, of course, there are some limitations to this idea. Cultural, media, and family influences on competitive conflict. Now, we talked about that earlier, right? We're not blank slates. We all have ideas about what conflict is and how to deal with it in our own context. And so there's a lot already embedded in us and in our culture and our media that says, no, we fight. We go to the mattresses, right? You hear that term from the Godfather? We're going to go to the mattresses. In other words, we're going to fight. We're going to go to war. And so there's such a pervasive competitive culture. We live in such a competitive culture. This idea of win-win, it seems foreign to us. And of course, sometimes there's unconscious competing goals. Sometimes we don't even know what our goals are. We'll talk more about different types of goals here coming up. And of course, there's challenges in applying win-win strategies. It takes a lot of work, consideration, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so what did we learn in this week's lesson? Well, we learned that conflict is a natural occurring phenomenon in organizational life, and therefore we must learn how to deal with it in ways that are healthy. We learned that the adversary system was a leap forward in understanding conflict, and there are still many remnants of this in society today, and that we should learn how to deal with this. And the idea of win-win as an important step forward, and it helps us to see that conflict is not necessarily a win-lose proposition, but we can see it from a perspective of where all of our goals can be met. Well, I hope this was helpful to you. Thanks for tuning in. God bless you. We'll see you in the next lesson.